Hello and welcome to the Magic Lantern DVD guide for the Nikon D40. The D40 makes an impressive addition to Nikon's line of digital SLRs and offers an unprecedented combination of performance, ease of operation, and affordability. While this entry-level camera is designed with the novice photographer in mind, it offers plenty of advanced features that serious photographers will appreciate as well. It's an excellent camera that will have you shooting great pictures for years to come. But like all SLRs, the D40 has a lot of features and functions that can be confusing at first if you want to go beyond the basic snapshot settings. Even though Nikon would have you believe that you can shoot professional caliber photos just by aiming the camera and pressing the shutter button, you know it's not really that easy. Oh, maybe you'll get lucky sometimes, but the D40, even though it's an excellent camera, can't take great pictures for you. And why would you want it to? Photography isn't supposed to be a chore. Shouldn't it be fun, challenging, and creative? Well, hopefully that's why you bought this DVD, to learn how to take great pictures with the D40. During this program, I'm going to teach you what you need to know to turn off the automatic controls and take control of the D40 settings yourself so you can shoot like a professional. Now, because our time here is limited and the purpose of this DVD is to teach you specifically about the Nikon D40 and not to get sidetracked explaining basic photography skills, I won't be spending a lot of time on general concepts such as depth of field, shutter speed, and aperture. If you want to learn more about general photographic techniques, I suggest that you get any of the dozens of Lark photography books. They are excellent and offer something for every skill level. And as I said, this DVD has been created to get you up to speed on the D40 as quickly as possible. So let's get started. I think the best place to begin is to take a walk around the camera itself and get familiar with the functions of the external buttons, switches, and other controls. Then we'll go back later and take a closer look at most of them in other chapters of the DVD. Now, I recommend that you get your camera out and follow along with me. Now, at times you may want to pause the DVD to experiment with the settings and try things out for yourself. The D40's design is well thought out, and it's much simpler to use for beginners than its bigger brothers, the D80 and D200. And the most logical place to begin our tour is on the top of the camera with the power switch. To turn the camera on, you just rotate the switch to the on position, and it will be ready and waiting by the time you can put your eye to the viewfinder. Now, surrounded by the power switch is the shutter release button. Pressing it halfway down will activate the autofocus and auto exposure functions so that the camera can start making its calculations for taking the best picture. Now, to get good results, you need to press the shutter button halfway down, hold it there for a beat or two while the camera determines the best settings, and then press the shutter button the rest of the way to actually take the photo. The response time of the D40 is almost instantaneous, so you shouldn't miss any shots. Next to the shutter release is the exposure compensation button that can be used to override the camera's automatic exposure settings. Next, there's the shooting information button. Pressing it will turn the shooting information display on and off. Anytime you want to check your camera settings, just press the button and there they all are. Learning to understand what this display tells you and how to change the camera settings represented here will be very important to taking great photos. The most important feature on the top of the camera is the mode dial that is used for selecting the current exposure mode. The D40 has 12 different exposure modes to choose from, and each one of them will change how the camera takes your pictures. The exposure mode not only affects how the camera calculates the exposure, it also affects how the flash functions, how the images are processed before they are saved to the memory card, and even how the autofocus system functions. Choosing the best exposure mode for any given shooting situation will make all the difference in how your pictures turn out. We'll take a detailed look at the different modes later on, and I'll have some suggestions as to which ones to use, when to use them, and which ones to avoid using at all. On the front of the D40, you'll find several more controls. This small light actually serves three purposes. First, it functions as the autofocus assist illuminator by shining a beam of light to help the camera focus when you're shooting in dark surroundings. Second, in self-timer mode, it blinks while the timer counts down and then shines steadily for 2 seconds before the picture is taken. And third, when you've got red eye reduction turned on with the built-in flash, it lights for approximately 1 second just before the picture is taken to cause the subject's pupils to contract. Moving over to the other side of the lens, we'll start at the bottom and work our way up the camera. This button is the lens release button. One of the great things about having an SLR is the ability to change lenses to suit different shooting situations. The focal length of a lens will have a huge effect on what your pictures look like. Certain subjects lend themselves to specific focal lengths. For example, wildlife and sports are often best photographed using telephoto lenses with focal lengths of 200 millimeters or longer. Portraits look great when shot with focal lengths between 50 and 80 millimeters, while landscapes often demand the use of wide-angle lenses with short focal lengths around 20 millimeters or less. To remove a lens from the camera, make sure the camera is turned off, then press down on the button and turn the lens clockwise and take it off. Now to mount a lens on the camera, again, make sure the power is turned off, align the index marks, slide the lens firmly into the mount, and then rotate it counterclockwise until you hear it lock into place. One thing to be aware of before purchasing additional lenses is that many older Nikon lenses are not compatible with the D40, so do your homework before buying any extra lenses. What you want to look for is the designation AF-S in the model number of the lens. So if you're looking at a lens that doesn't say AF-S, then chances are it won't work right with the D40. Just above the lens release button is a special programmable function button that gives you instant access to any one of 5 functions that you can choose with one of the custom setting menus. Now, I don't want to get sidetracked talking about the menus just yet, but your choices for the function button are self-timer, shooting mode, image quality and size, ISO sensitivity, and white balance. By default, this button is programmed to activate the self-timer mode, and that's probably the best setting to leave it on. Now, to take a picture with the timer, you press the function button once and then press the shutter button. The camera will beep and the light will flash while it counts down, and then it will take the picture. If you want to take another picture with the timer, you have to press the function button again because the camera doesn't stay in self-timer mode. Now, the last button on the front of the camera is the flash mode button that is used to control how the flash functions. Depending on the shooting mode that you've selected, sometimes pressing this button will release the built-in flash and activate it for shooting. Now, when you're done using the flash, just press it back down until it locks into place. For more flash power, less chance of red eye, and more creative flexibility, you can attach an optional external flash to the hot shoe. If you plan on doing a lot of flash photography, I suggest investing in an external flash unit. Now, on the left side of the camera, under this cover, we find 2 jacks that are used to connect the camera to other equipment. The first jack is for connecting your D40 to a television monitor with the supplied video cable. That way you can view your pictures on a TV monitor instead of the tiny LCD. And the second jack is a standard USB port for connecting the camera to a computer or even directly to a printer. On the back of the camera, we find the greatest number of controls. And once you've learned this basic layout, it's pretty easy to master them all. The most dominant feature on the rear of the D40 is the large LCD monitor, which actually does triple duty. 1, it's used to navigate through the camera's menu system. 2, it's used to review your pictures and see what you've shot. And 3, the most important function of all, it shows you the camera's current settings while you're shooting. Other models of Nikon digital SLRs have an LCD panel located right here on top of the camera that shows current settings like shutter speed, f-stop, and white balance while you're shooting. However, on the D40, there is no LCD on top of the camera, and all of that information is now shown on the monitor instead. In fact, there are actually 3 different ways of viewing the shooting information display. This is the default mode, and it's called the graphic display. This is called the classic display. And if you really want to get creative, this is the wallpaper display, which is basically just the same as the graphic display, except that the solid background is replaced by any picture you choose from those stored on your memory card. But I'd suggest not using this display because it makes the text too hard to read. So that really leaves us with only 2 choices for monitoring the camera's settings: classic or graphic. We'll see how to choose one or the other with the Info Display Format menu in the next chapter. But of the 2, I personally prefer the classic mode because it's easier to read, better organized, and easier to understand. In the upper left corner, you'll find the current exposure mode that has been selected with the mode dial on top of the camera. The shutter speed, the aperture of the lens, also known as the f-stop, the image quality setting, the image size, white balance mode, ISO sensitivity, shooting mode, focus mode, the autofocus area mode, metering mode, flash compensation, exposure compensation, the flash mode, the active focus area, the optimize image setting, the beep indicator, the battery level indicator, and the remaining capacity of the memory card. Nearly every setting you need to know about is conveniently displayed right here on one easy-to-understand screen. But that's not the best part. To change almost any of the settings, you just press the I button once. Use the multi-selector to highlight the setting you want to change. Press the OK button. Choose a different setting. Press the OK button again to lock it in. And then press the I button to finish. This has to be one of the easiest cameras I've ever worked with. Just above the LCD is the viewfinder. It's clear, bright, and a pleasure to use, which is very important because unlike point-and-shoot cameras that allow you to display a live moving picture on the LCD to compose your shot, with an SLR, the only way to see what you're shooting is through the viewfinder. There's a lot of important information shown in the viewfinder, including the focus brackets, the in-focus indicator, a graphic to tell you which of the 3 focus brackets is active, the shutter speed, the aperture, and the remaining capacity of the memory card. Other information might also be displayed too, depending on your current camera settings. The focus of the viewfinder eyepiece must be adjusted to suit your own eyesight by turning the diopter adjustment control until the focus brackets and the icons at the bottom appear sharp. Next to the diopter adjustment control is the auto exposure lock, auto focus lock button, which also doubles as the protect button as well. We'll see how it's used later. The command dial can be used alone or in combination with other controls to adjust certain exposure settings. We've already talked a little bit about the multi-selector control and the OK button. So let's move down to the delete button. Sometimes you'll know right away that a photo you took is no good, so why not just get rid of it and free up some space on the memory card? You can do that with the delete button. Whenever there's a photo displayed on the LCD monitor, press the delete button once and a confirmation screen will appear. Press the delete button again to confirm the deletion and the picture is gone, so be careful. Over on the left side of the camera, there are 4 additional buttons. There's the playback button, menu button, thumbnail button, and the playback zoom button. These all work closely with each other, so it makes sense to talk about them all at once. Images can be viewed on the monitor at any time by pressing the playback button. Whenever you're playing back images, they can be viewed individually or as thumbnails by pressing the thumbnail button. You can choose to show either 4 images per page or 9. The 4 arrow buttons on the multi-selector can be used to scroll through the images. When you find a photo that you want to view full screen, just press the OK button to exit the thumbnail view. And if full screen view isn't good enough to see the details, for example, if you wanted to check to see if an image was in focus, you can press the playback zoom button repeatedly to zoom in. Each time you press the button, the image is magnified a little more. To decrease the magnification, press the thumbnail button to zoom back out. While the image is magnified, you can scroll around to see other parts of the image by using the 4 arrow buttons. Whenever you're finished, just press the OK button to return to the normal full-screen view. If you've got an important picture on the memory card that you want to prevent from being accidentally erased, press the Protect button. Whenever you see the key icon overlaid on a picture, that means it's locked and can't be deleted. That is, unless you reformat the entire memory card, and then everything on the card is erased. Many of the D40's most important functions can only be accessed via the menu screens, and those are displayed on the monitor by pushing the menu button. By the end of this DVD, you should have no problem navigating through the menus and making changes. But for now, let's skip the menus because we'll devote a whole chapter to them later on. On this side of the camera, you'll find the slot for the memory card. The door is opened just by sliding it back. You should always make sure the camera is turned off before inserting or ejecting a card. Now, if you forget, chances are nothing bad will happen, but it's just good practice to turn the power off before removing either the memory card, the battery, or the lens. Now, pressing on the card briefly will eject it. The D40 uses secure digital memory cards for storage, and I suggest having 1 or 2 1-gigabyte cards would be a good place to start. Now, paying a premium for high-speed cards isn't necessary, so buy whatever name brand card is least expensive. Now, memory cards must be formatted before they can be used for the first time, and then again later on whenever you want to completely erase all the images from a card and start shooting with a clean slate. Again, I recommend that you reformat your cards every time you load them into your camera, assuming, of course, that you have already transferred all the images stored on the card to your computer for safekeeping. Please note that formatting a memory card will erase all data on the card, including any photos that have been protected. Formatting a card is very easy and takes just a couple of seconds. Here's how to do it. Press the menu button. Use the multi-selector to navigate to the Setup menu screen. Highlight Format Memory Card. Press the OK button. Highlight Yes. And press OK again. That's it. When the formatting is done, the LCD will return to the Setup menu and you're ready to start shooting. Well, that's it. That concludes our walk around the camera, and you should now have a better understanding of the external controls of the D40. I know this chapter wasn't too exciting, but it's very important to have this basic foundation as we continue through the rest of the DVD. Like all digital cameras, many of the D40's most important functions can only be changed by accessing the menu system. Fortunately, the D40 has a simple menu structure that is very easy to understand. As I explained before, the menus have been divided into 5 main pages, each represented by an icon on the left side of the screen. There's Playback, Shooting, Custom Setting, Setup, and Retouch. Now, because the D40 has over 50 different menus, and each of them has at least 2 and sometimes several settings to choose from, you shouldn't expect to understand them all right away. In fact, there are many menus that even a professional photographer might not ever use. So just relax and learn the D40 at your own pace. The important menu choices will be discussed over the course of the DVD, and the rest are either self-explanatory or should really only be changed by advanced users who already understand what they do. Another reason we don't need to talk about every menu in detail is because the D40 has a handy in-camera help system that covers nearly every menu. Whenever you see this icon on screen, you can hold down the Help button to show a brief description of the currently highlighted menu. The explanations are actually quite helpful, and they make a good learning tool as you get to know the camera better. The playback menus control how you view images on the monitor, transfer images to a computer, or even print directly to a printer. The shooting menus control the settings that determine the look, style, size, and quality of the pictures you take. The custom setting menus are used to customize how the camera functions while you're shooting. The setup menus are used to format memory cards and perform basic camera setups. And as I said earlier, the retouch menus allow you to make a variety of in-camera adjustments and enhancements to images after they have been shot. If you don't want to use a computer to edit your images, the retouch menus are the next best thing. And you don't have to worry about ruining the original image, because the camera automatically saves the retouch version as a new file. So you can always go back to the original later if you decide you don't like the changes that you've made. And that's good. If retouching a picture meant that you were going to overwrite the original image, I'd warn you never to use retouch. But fortunately, that's not the case. De-lighting automatically lightens shadows in pictures with a lot of contrast. Red eye correction automatically detects and fixes the annoying red eye effect sometimes caused by flash. Trim can be used to produce cropped versions of your images. Monochrome changes your image to black and white, sepia, or cyanotype, which means blue tinted. Filter effects tries to simulate the look you'd have gotten if you had used certain kinds of glass filters screwed onto the front of your lens when you took the picture. Small picture creates smaller versions of your pictures for easy sharing. And image overlay merges 2 raw files that you select into a single image. I have mixed feelings about using the retouch functions. On the one hand, I'm the kind of person who prefers to do all my image adjustments on a computer where I have maximum control and I can see the results on a large computer screen instead of a tiny LCD. On the other hand, I don't want to discourage you from using the retouch functions for times when you want to make some simple image adjustments, but either don't have the time or don't want to be bothered with using a computer. Just don't make the mistake of thinking retouch will eliminate the need for a good photo editing software program. Whenever you have pictures stored on the memory card that are retouched copies of an original image, this icon is superimposed to remind you. Here's a tip. If you find that it's hard to see the results you're getting with the retouch functions because of the tiny LCD, you can connect the D40 to a TV monitor so you can see your changes on a much larger screen. If you're following along with your own camera, you may have noticed that some of the menu options I've shown may not be visible on your camera, and there's a reason for that. Nikon has set up the D40 to automatically hide many of the menus that they believe are least likely to be changed, and I can understand that. It makes sense to hide seldom used menus so they're out of the way. But that's not the best way to get to know the camera. So let's go ahead and change the way the camera displays menus. Press the menu button. Use the arrow buttons to navigate to the setup menu page. Highlight CSM Setup menu and select it by pressing OK. Now we see that there are 3 menu display options. Simple is the default setting, and it makes the camera hide a lot of the menus so you don't see them listed. Well, that's okay for the less important menus that are rarely used, but it also hides a few very important menus that you need to use often. So this isn't a good choice. Full, as the name implies, makes the camera show every menu all of the time. Now that might be fine for someone who changes all of the menus frequently, but personally, I don't need to see a bunch of menus I'll rarely if ever use. That's why the third option, My Menu, is the best choice. My Menu lets you choose exactly which menus are visible and which are hidden. This is a great feature of the D40 and I love it. Here's how it works. Choose My Menu by pressing the OK button, and then scroll down to one of the 5 choices. For this example, I'm going to choose to customize the Setup menu and tell the D40 to hide some of the menu options that I doubt I'll ever need to change again. Now I've already set the correct time and date on my camera, so I'm going to uncheck the World Time menu by pressing the OK button to hide it. My video mode won't ever need changing unless I move to Europe, so I'll uncheck that. I only speak English, so I can hide the language menu. I don't plan on using a USB cable to connect my camera directly to a computer or printer, so it can be unchecked. Some of the other menus are already unchecked by default, so let's leave them that way. To lock in my choices, I scroll back up to highlight Done, and then press the OK button. Now if I wanted to, I could go ahead and customize any of the other menus as well. But let's just press OK again to finish up. Now you can see that there are only 6 menu options shown on the Setup menu page, instead of the 10 that would have been shown with the simple setting, or the 16 that would have been shown with the full setting. The camera is going to be easier to work with now because the Setup menu is less cluttered with options I don't need to see. An interesting thing to know about hiding menus is that even when they're hidden, the settings they control are still in effect. In other words, hiding the menu does not undo whatever custom setting you made with the menu to begin with. So if you customize a menu and you don't think you'll ever change it again, I suggest that you hide it. Now, before we finish up this chapter, I want to take a few minutes and explain what a few of the other menus are used for, and to show you the ones that I like to customize and explain why. First, let's go back to the CSM Setup menu and change it from My Menu to Full, so that we can see all of the menus right now. And then let's go to the Shooting menu and start there. The first 3 menus have to do with controlling the look of your images, the quality and the size. These are very important menus, and we'll explore them in detail during the chapter on image quality. White balance is also very important, and we've devoted an entire chapter to white balance later on. ISO sensitivity is covered in the exposure and metering chapter. The noise reduction option can be turned on to have the camera automatically reduce unwanted digital noise when you're shooting at ISO speeds over 800 or during long exposures. Moving along to the custom setting menu, we've got 17 choices for changing how the camera operates, plus a reset option to put everything back on the default settings if you want to undo your changes. If you don't want the camera to make any beeping noises while it focuses or counts down in the timer mode, you can turn this setting off. The next 2 menus are important, but we'll talk about them in detail during the focus chapter. Shooting mode is also an important menu to know about, and you should be careful not to get it confused with the settings on the mode dial that I called the exposure modes earlier. You may have noticed in the D40 owner's manual that for some reason Nikon often refers to the choices on the mode dial as shooting modes. Yet here we have a totally unrelated setting that is also called the shooting mode. I don't understand why Nikon chose to make things so confusing, but to keep things straight, I will always refer to the settings on the mode dial as exposure modes, so we don't get them confused with the real shooting modes that are selected from this menu. So what is a shooting mode anyway? Well, on some SLRs, these choices would actually be called drive modes because they control what the camera does when you press the shutter button. Now, most of the time, you'll want the camera to take just one picture only, but sometimes you'll want it to fire off several pictures in a row while you hold the shutter button down. Or maybe you'll want to use the self-timer so you can run over and get into the picture yourself. There are 5 shooting mode choices on the D40. Single frame is the mode you'll use most often. The camera takes one photo each time the shutter release button is pressed. In continuous mode, the camera will fire off up to 2.5 frames per second for as long as you hold down the shutter button or until the buffer is full. Normally, you'll be able to shoot as many as 100 pictures in just 40 seconds before the camera slows down. Self-timer delays taking the picture by 10 seconds after you press the shutter button. The length of the delay can be changed to 2, 5, or 20 seconds with one of the custom setting menus. The delayed remote and quick response remote settings both require the use of an optional remote control, so you can release the shutter without even putting your hands on the camera. This is a great way to prevent blurry images while shooting at slow shutter speeds with the camera mounted on a tripod. Like I said, single frame is the shooting mode you'll use 99% of the time. So let's leave it set on that. Metering is another important control for you to learn about because it determines how the camera calculates the best automatic exposure settings just before it takes the picture. If you choose the wrong metering mode, you won't get good results. We'll talk about these 3 choices in the metering and exposure chapter later on. If you want to be sure you can't start taking pictures without a memory card in the camera, leave this menu on lock. If you like having the camera display pictures automatically on the monitor for a few seconds right after you take them, leave this menu turned on. The flash level menu can be used to override the intensity of the flash by making it more or less powerful. For example, -1 is half power and +1 is double the normal strength. This is called flash compensation. Normally, you'll want to just leave it set to 0. If the autofocus assist is turned on, the camera will shine a beam of light to help it focus properly when you're shooting in darkness or dim lighting. I leave this turned on, but it only works if the subject is within a few feet of the camera. ISO Auto is a setting I recommend keeping turned off. Otherwise, in some exposure modes, the camera will raise the ISO level whenever it wants to, and that's not a good thing. As we'll talk about later, as the ISO setting gets higher, it adds unwanted graininess and noise to your pictures. So this is a setting you typically won't want to let the D40 change on its own. The function button menu allows you to customize the function button we saw earlier on the front of the camera. With the default setting, pressing the function button will activate the self-timer mode, and I suggest leaving it that way. As you'll see, the other choices are so easy to change on the fly anyway that there's really no reason to program any of them for the function button. Instead of thinking of the function button as the function button, think of it as simply the self-timer button. The auto exposure lock, auto focus lock menu can be used to customize what happens when you press the lock button over here on the camera body. In the default mode, holding the button down will lock in the current exposure and focus settings so they won't change even if the camera or subject moves. This menu offers you several customization choices, but the one I recommend using is AE lock only. I'll explain why later in the metering and exposure chapter. The rest of the custom setting menus are advanced controls that you probably won't need to change, so we're going to skip them. Just leave them on the default settings and you'll be fine. The next group of menus are the setup menus. As we saw a few minutes ago, you can use the CSM setup menu to choose whether the camera displays all of the menus or just some of the menus. The Format Memory Card menu provides the only way to format memory cards with the D40. The Info Display Format menu is worth taking a closer look at because this is where you can decide which style of shooting information display you want to use. If you recall, there are three choices: classic, graphic, or wallpaper. But the decision is a little more complicated than that because you also have the option of choosing a different format for different exposure modes. I mentioned earlier that there are 12 exposure modes on the D40 to select from with the mode dial. We're going to talk about them in more detail later on and find out what the differences are. But I want to point out right now that they are divided into two groups: the advanced modes and the digital vary program modes, which Nikon sometimes calls the point and shoot modes. And that's the term I'll be using through the rest of the video. So let's go back to the Info Display Format menu. Now you can designate which format of shooting information display the D40 uses when you're shooting with any of the point and shoot modes, and which format is used for the advanced modes. For example, you might want to choose the graphic display for the point and shoot modes and the classic display for the advanced modes. You can also use this menu to select the wallpaper option if you'd like, but I don't recommend using that format because it makes the text too hard to read. Let's press the menu button to lock in our choices and move along to the next menu, which is called Auto Shooting Info. In the default mode, the D40 never shows you the camera's settings on the monitor automatically while you're shooting. You have to press one of the two information buttons to turn on the shooting information display when you want to see it. But with the Auto Shooting Info menu, you can change the D40 so that it automatically shows you the shooting information screen whenever you press the shutter button halfway down. You can turn this on for the point and shoot modes and/or the advanced modes independently. It's up to you whether or not you turn this on. And seeing the shooting information all of the time sounds like a great idea at first, but you'll probably find that the glare from the LCD monitor will bother your eye while you're looking through the viewfinder. For that reason, I usually leave it turned off. Now the next few menus are self-explanatory, so we'll jump down to Image Comment. Here you can attach a 36-character description or comment to all of the photos you take while this option is turned on. I think it's cumbersome to type the text, and the comments can only be viewed using special Nikon software, so I never bother with it, but maybe you'll find a good use for it. The USB menu can be used to change how the D40 communicates with printers and computers if you connect them directly to the camera. The Folders menu allows you to store your photos in different folders on the memory card. In much the same way you organize files on your computer into different folders. File number sequence is a setting that I strongly urge you to change. When you start shooting with a fresh memory card in the D40, it names each photo that you take with a sequential number starting at 0001. However, after you've transferred those photos to your computer and you've reformatted the memory card, it starts the numbering over again at 0001. So you end up with multiple pictures stored on your computer with the same file name. That can be a big problem because of the danger of accidentally overwriting an important photo with another image with the same name. But if you change this menu to On, the camera won't ever restart the numbering over again when you change memory cards. Instead, it will always continue from the last number used, so you won't have duplicate file names. The Mirror Lockup menu is used for cleaning the inside of the camera. The Firmware Version menu just tells you which version of software the camera is using. The Dust Off Reference Photo menu can be used to help remove dust specks from your photos, which is a constant problem with all digital SLRs. However, you must have a copy of Nikon's Capture NX software on your computer to actually make it work. And that $125 program does not come with your camera. The final menu is called Auto Image Rotation. When this is turned on, the camera will memorize the orientation of the camera when each picture is taken, either vertical or horizontal, and then use that stored information to rotate the image right side up when you look at it on the LCD or transfer it to your computer. You can leave this turned on. Well, that's it for the menus. I encourage you to explore them all and experiment with the various settings and see what works best for you. You don't have to worry about wasting money on film and processing, and you can see the results instantly. Isn't digital great? If you are new to digital photography, I guarantee you that you will be a better digital photographer than you were a film photographer, because you'll shoot more, experiment more, and learn faster from seeing the results immediately. A big advantage that digital photography has over film photography is the ability to instantly view your images on the LCD while you're still out taking pictures. There's no more waiting hours or days until you get your film developed to see how you did. If you remember, earlier in the DVD, we looked at some basic playback functions and learned how to review your pictures, protect a photo, zoom in to check the details of an image, delete unwanted photos, and how to display images in thumbnail groups of 4 or 9. Well, if you want to go beyond these basic playback functions, there are some advanced controls that you'll want to know about. There are 5 submenus within the playback menu that affect the playback and editing of the images on your memory card. The delete menu is handy when you want to get rid of several images at the same time. Select all if you want to erase all the photos stored in the current folder, except those that are protected. But if you only want to delete certain images, choose selected. Now you can use the left and right arrow buttons to scroll through the images on the card and find the ones you don't want to keep. Press the up arrow button to mark them and the down arrow button to unmark them. Any pictures with a key icon superimposed are protected and can't be deleted. If you want to take a closer look at any picture, hold down the playback zoom button momentarily to magnify it. Once you've selected the pictures to delete, press the OK button, highlight Yes, and then press the OK button again to finish the deletion. The next menu is called Playback Folder. I recommend you change this setting to All so that you are always viewing every picture that's stored on the memory card. If you don't, you increase the chances of accidentally formatting a card that has pictures on it that you may have forgotten about. When Rotate Tall is turned on, the camera will display vertical pictures resized and rotated on the monitor for viewing them right side up. But Rotate Tall only works for pictures that were taken while the Auto Image Rotation menu, which we saw at the end of the previous chapter, was turned on. The slideshow menu can be used to play back images as an automated sequence. The default interval that each photo is displayed can be adjusted from 2 to 10 seconds. I like to use the supplied video cable to connect the D40 to a TV monitor to watch the slideshow. This is the fastest and easiest way to share your pictures with friends and family. JPEG files taken with the D40 can be printed directly to a compatible printer by selecting the Print Set menu and then marking the pictures you want to print. Okay, that's it for the playback menus. But there's still a very important playback function to talk about. When the camera records an image, it also stores a lot of technical information about that image called metadata that can be reviewed later with the picture. And this information can be a very useful learning tool. There are actually 5 different options for displaying information about each image, plus a 6th option for copies of images that have been retouched. The current view can be changed by pressing the up and down arrow buttons on the multi-selector. This is the most basic view, and it's called the highlight screen. It offers the least amount of information about the image, but it does have one unique feature that you won't find in any of the other views. Notice the flashing white area in the picture. That's called highlights, and it's the camera's way of warning you that part of your image is nearly pure white and therefore possibly overexposed. Now that's not necessarily anything to worry about, and depending on the subject of the picture, it might be perfectly acceptable. The camera is merely bringing the potential overexposure situation to your attention so that you are aware of it. It's your decision whether it's worth it or not to adjust the exposure settings and shoot the picture again. The next view is called the histogram screen. A histogram is a graph that shows an image's brightness level, and it offers the most precise way of checking your exposure. It's a good idea to take the time to learn to understand histograms. The next screen is called Basic Information, and it provides a little more data about the picture. Now we can see the folder number where the picture is stored on the memory card, the date and time the picture was taken, the file name, the image quality setting, and the image size. The next view is called Shooting Data, Page 1. Here we can see what many of the technical settings were when the picture was taken. They are well labeled, so I won't spend time pointing them out one by one, but you'll find the focal length of the lens, the shutter speed, the aperture, and others. The final screen is called Shooting Data, Page 2, and it shows even more metadata that couldn't fit onto Page 1. Between these two pages of shooting data, just about every important fact about the picture is available for you to review and learn from. This is one of the great benefits of digital photography that film could never offer. Another playback function I want to point out is the OK button. Whenever a picture is displayed on the screen, you can press the OK button to jump straight to the retouch menu. So if you find yourself using the retouch menu often, this shortcut can save you a lot of time. One of the most important things to do before you start taking pictures is to make sure that the image quality settings are the way you want them. If you shoot with the wrong settings, there might not be much you can do to fix the problem later if the settings weren't right. Now you've probably already heard the terms JPEG and RAW to describe the two types of files that can be recorded with digital SLRs. So what's the difference between them? JPEG is the worldwide standard for digital photography, and it's the most popular and compatible format. It provides excellent quality and it's easy to work with. Files are immediately ready for viewing or printing without any further processing. For most people, JPEG is all you'll ever need to use. RAW, on the other hand, offers slightly improved picture quality and more control for editing the image later on a computer. But it's a tedious format to work with and requires special software. Unless you enjoy tweaking your images one by one on the computer and have the time, software, and computer skills to handle them, RAW won't be the best choice for you. Throughout the rest of this DVD, we'll only be working with JPEG files. So once we've settled on JPEG as the format to use, we've still got to make some other choices before we can start shooting. Fortunately, after we've made these decisions once, we might not ever have to bother with them again. Let's start by pressing the menu button and going to the shooting menu. This is where all of the quality settings are located. The most important setting is the one for image quality. How good do you want your pictures to be? Well, there are 5 choices, but it's easy to whittle them down to the best one. First of all, we've already decided that we want to shoot JPEG files today, so we can eliminate both of the RAW options. Of course, the bottom option will actually record both a RAW file and a JPEG file simultaneously, but the JPEG file will be recorded at the lowest quality setting, so it's really just meant to be used as a preview of the RAW file. That leaves 3 choices. The difference among them is the amount of compression that will be applied to each image, and therefore the quality of the picture. All digital cameras compress images before storing them on the memory card, so that they take up less space. The higher the compression, the more pictures you can fit on a memory card. But the trade-off of higher compression is a very noticeable drop in picture quality. Fine has the least amount of compression and so therefore offers the best quality. That's the one we want to use. You should almost always shoot with the image quality set to fine, especially these days when the prices of large capacity memory cards have fallen to a fraction of what they were in the past. Now the next decision that has to be made is to choose an image size. Image size is measured in pixels, and the greater the number of pixels, the better the image quality will be. On the D40, large images are 6 megapixels, medium images are 3.3 megapixels, and small images are 1.5 megapixels. You can always make a large file smaller, but you can't make a small file bigger without a significant loss of quality. So you should set this menu choice to large and leave it there. It's very easy to check your current quality settings at any time while you're shooting by just looking at the shooting information display. Now, if we wanted to, we could start shooting right now. We've set the camera to record large-sized JPEGs with the least amount of compression, and that's the perfect setting for almost anything you'll shoot. However, there is one more control that you also need to be aware of. Whenever you're shooting with one of the 4 advanced exposure modes, you can also choose an Optimize Image setting from this menu. Optimize Image offers advanced control over sharpness, color saturation, contrast, and hue. There are 6 presets plus the option to create your own custom setting. Normal is a good choice for all-round routine shooting. That's what I leave my camera set on most of the time. Softer reduces the amount of in-camera sharpening a little bit. Vivid increases sharpening, contrast, and color saturation. More vivid further enhances sharpness, contrast, and color saturation to produce a very crisp image. Portrait lowers contrast and softens the sharpening to smooth out skin texture and hide minor blemishes. Black and white reduces the color saturation to 0 so that you can take photos in black and white. And custom is for creating your own profile from scratch. It's the only one of the choices that can be modified. The others are what they are. The custom parameters you can manipulate are image sharpening, tone compensation, which means contrast, color mode, to control the way colors are reproduced, saturation, to change the vividness of the colors, and hue adjustment, to add a color cast to the image. So which of the 7 options on the Optimize Image menu do I recommend you use? Well, that depends on you. If you're going to load the images into your computer and do some image enhancements, such as sharpening and contrast adjustments before you print your pictures, then I suggest leaving it on normal. But if you don't want to be bothered with making adjustments on a computer, then go ahead and choose the setting that seems to go along best with whatever subject you're shooting. Vivid is usually my preferred setting if I'm not going to be editing on the computer. One of the most important parts of taking professional quality photos is getting the exposure right. Even though you might be able to compensate for bad exposure later by manipulating the image on the computer, there's just no substitute for getting it right in the camera. So it's no wonder that there are more controls on the D40 that have to do with exposure and metering than any other part of the picture-taking process. Now, I like to explain exposure by breaking it down into 3 parts. First, you need to decide which of the 12 exposure modes you're going to use. Second, if you choose one of the 4 advanced exposure modes, then you also have to tell the camera how you want it to meter the scene. Metering is the term used to describe how the camera decides what the best exposure settings should be just before it snaps the shutter. And third, there are a couple of minor controls that you can use to fine-tune the exposure. Sometimes photographers have a tendency to make things seem more complicated than they really are. But when you boil it all down, exposure is simply the product of an equation made up of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. That's really all there is to it. Each of the exposure controls on the D40 do nothing more than modify one or more of these three variables. For example, if the shutter speed gets faster, which allows less light into the camera, then the aperture must be opened bigger to let in more light to compensate. For every plus or minus, there has to be an opposite change in one of the other two settings to keep the exposure in balance. Now, there are 12 exposure modes available on the D40, and choosing any of them is as simple as rotating the mode dial, which is divided into two parts, the advanced modes and the point-and-shoot modes. Depending on the mode you've chosen, sometimes you'll be in complete control of all three of these exposure settings, and sometimes you'll only have partial control. The 8 point-and-shoot modes are fully automatic, automatic with flash disabled, portrait, landscape, child, sports, close-up, and night portrait. All of the point-and-shoot modes are really just different variations of putting the camera on automatic exposure. So if you simply don't want to be bothered with setting any of the camera's controls yourself, just turn the dial to one of these modes and start shooting. But I encourage you to think twice before using any of the point-and-shoot modes, because they take too much control out of your hands and give it to the camera. Not only do they take charge of the exposure settings, they also override just about every other custom setting on the camera, including white balance, image optimization, metering mode, and more. But to make matters even worse, in my opinion, these modes don't even use the best settings for the type of shooting they are supposedly intended for. So my advice is to learn to use the advanced modes instead, because they give you a lot more control over the camera's settings. The advanced modes are program auto exposure, shutter priority, aperture priority, and manual exposure. Once you feel comfortable using the D40, these are the modes you'll want to use as often as you can so you get the very best results. The question is, which of the 4 advanced exposure modes should you use at any given time? Well, that depends on what you're shooting. Manual exposure mode can be the best choice if you have a good understanding of photography and you want maximum flexibility. The manual shooting mode is the only one that gives you full control over every setting on the camera. In manual mode, the shutter speed is set by turning the command dial, and the aperture is set by holding down the exposure compensation button while you turn the command dial. Aperture priority exposure mode can be the best choice if controlling depth of field is important. For example, you'd probably want a small aperture for landscape shooting so that everything is in focus, and a large aperture for shooting a portrait so that you can limit the depth of field. Shutter priority exposure mode can be the best choice if controlling the shutter speed is important. For example, you'd want a faster shutter speed, over 1/1000th of a second for fast-moving action, and a slow shutter speed, under 1 second, for special effects like this. Programmed auto exposure mode can be a good choice if you're new to photography, or for times when you don't want to bother tinkering with the camera's settings. In this mode, the D40 will do most of the thinking for you. But unlike the point-and-shoot exposure modes, you'll still be able to control things like white balance, image optimization, and metering yourself. I usually shoot in either aperture priority or shutter priority modes, so that I'm not leaving too much of the decision-making to the camera. I'm going to choose aperture priority for the rest of this chapter. Now, the second part of controlling exposure is to decide which method of metering you want the camera to use. As I said, metering is how the camera analyzes the scene you're shooting and then calculates what the proper exposure should be just before the shutter snaps. The D40 has three choices for metering: 3D color matrix 2, center weighted, and spot metering. You can choose any one of them when you're shooting with any of the four advanced exposure modes, but only 3D color matrix is available with the point and shoot modes. 3D color matrix metering does a great job in all sorts of shooting situations because it integrates exposure information from many parts of the frame and works in sync with autofocus, so it knows where the subject is situated in the composition, thus giving that part of the frame priority. This is the best mode to trust for just about everything you shoot. Center-weighted metering measures light from the entire frame, but places the greatest emphasis on a circular area in the center. This can be a good choice for shooting portraits or any time the main subject occupies the center part of the frame. Spot metering measures light only from a very small part of the frame and ignores everything else in the picture. It can be a good choice for those occasions when your main subject is located in front of a background that is a lot brighter or darker. The particular part of the frame that is being metered at any given time is determined by which of the three focus brackets is active. We'll talk more about focus brackets in the next chapter. So let's review. We've selected aperture priority as our exposure mode and 3D color matrix as the metering mode. Now that's probably the combination I use most often, and most of my shots are going to be properly exposed. However, although the D40 is a sophisticated camera, it's just a machine, and the automatic metering won't always be correct. The camera doesn't know what you're actually taking a picture of, so sometimes it's going to be wrong. In certain situations, the metering system can be fooled into producing an underexposed, too dark, or an overexposed, too light image. So if you want good results in tricky lighting situations, sometimes you'll need to override the automatic exposure settings. There are several controls on the D40 that are designed just for that purpose. So let's take a quick look at the two most important ones. The D40's exposure compensation function is the easiest way to manipulate the exposure setting. By holding down the exposure compensation button and turning the command dial, you can increase or decrease the amount of light the camera is going to let into the camera when it takes the picture. If you select a positive value, the photo will look brighter. If you select a negative value, it will look darker. What you are doing with exposure compensation is letting the camera figure out what it thinks is the right exposure, and then you are telling it to add or subtract a certain amount of light from that value because you don't agree with it. Now, depending on which shooting mode you're in, the camera will either change the aperture or the shutter speed to let in more or less light. Now, here's an example of normal exposure: +1 exposure compensation and -1 exposure compensation. Another easy way to manipulate the exposure setting is with the auto exposure lock button. Under normal operation, the camera continually updates the exposure settings whenever the scene appears to get brighter or darker. Most of the time, that's exactly what you want the camera to do, but sometimes you don't want it to change the settings when you reframe the camera. By holding down the auto exposure lock button, you can freeze the current exposure settings where they are, so they won't change even when you reframe the shot. I should warn you, though, that with the default setting, the exposure lock button will also lock the focus at the same time. And I don't think that's such a good idea in most situations, because focus and exposure don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. So if you want to change the default, and I suggest that you should, go to Custom Setting menu number 12 and choose AE Lock Only. Now, one part of the exposure equation we haven't really talked about much is ISO. First of all, what is ISO? Well, ISO is simply a measurement of how sensitive the camera is to light. It's the digital equivalent of film speed. Remember buying rolls of 35mm film in speeds of 100, 200, 400, or 800? The higher the number, the better it was for shooting in low light. Well, the D40 doesn't use film, but Nikon has calibrated the camera to have equivalent ISO settings. The D40 has a wide range of standard ISO settings, from 200 up to 1600, and even beyond that to the equivalent of 3200. Each time the ISO number is doubled, the sensitivity of the camera is doubled. So that means that higher ISO numbers, such as 800, are better for low-light situations. However, setting a digital camera to a higher ISO comes at a price, because your pictures won't be as good. When you use a higher ISO, you are electronically amplifying the signal that is being generated by the CCD. And the more the signal is amplified, the lower the picture quality will be. For best results, you should always keep your ISO set as low as you can. ISO can be set on the D40 by turning on the shooting information display, pressing the I button, navigating to the ISO setting, and pressing the OK button. Now any of the ISO values can be selected. High 1 is the equivalent of 3200. Press the OK button to make your selection, and you're ready to shoot. In some modes, you may also see Auto as one of the available choices, but I don't recommend selecting that option. ISO is an important setting that you should always set yourself manually. Correct focus is a critical part of taking great photographs. With point-and-shoot cameras, you never have to think about focus, and you will usually get acceptable pictures. But with an SLR, you have total control over focus for truly professional results. But it takes some effort and some practice. Like any SLR, the D40 starts focusing as soon as the shutter button is pressed halfway. That's why you need to get into the habit of pressing the shutter button halfway down, pausing for a beat or two while the camera focuses and calculates the exposure, and then press the shutter button the rest of the way to take the picture. If you've got a compatible autofocus lens mounted on the D40, such as this 18 to 55mm zoom that came with it, you can choose from 3 autofocus modes plus manual focus. To use manual focus, make sure the switch on the lens is in this position, and then you can do all of the focusing yourself by turning the barrel of the lens. To give you some help, a green dot will appear in the viewfinder when the camera thinks that you've focused the lens properly. Manual focus is okay for those rare times when the camera can't seem to get it right. But 99% of the time, you'll want to use autofocus because it works so well. Moving the switch on the lens, if the lens has one, not all lenses have a switch, to the A position enables the lens for autofocusing, but not necessarily the camera itself. So you need to turn on the shooting information display to see which focus mode is actually selected. In this case, we see that the camera is on manual. So even though the switch on the lens is set to A, the camera isn't going to focus automatically unless we change this setting too. Press the I button, navigate to the focus mode, and press OK. Here are the 4 choices. We just talked about manual focus, but what are the 3 autofocus modes? Let's start in the middle. AFS stands for single servo. This mode is best for landscapes, posed portraits, or any subjects that don't move at all. In single servo mode, the shutter won't release until the lens has finished focusing. AFC stands for continuous servo. This mode is primarily designed for sports and any other time you need to track a moving subject. The camera will keep refocusing the lens continuously if the subject or camera moves, right up until the moment you press the shutter button. This is actually my favorite setting for all-around photography, and I use it almost exclusively. The third mode is AFA, which stands for Auto Select. This is just a hybrid of AFC and AFS. In this mode, the camera automatically switches back and forth between the other two modes whenever it wants to. I rarely use this mode because the results can be unpredictable and hard to control. So as I said, my favorite mode is continuous servo. But once I've selected it, there's still another decision to be made. I also have to tell the camera which area of the frame I want the camera to focus on. For example, in this shot, do we want the camera to focus here, here, or just let it decide automatically which is best? The part of the frame that the camera focuses on is called the active autofocus area. There are 3 autofocus areas on the D40, and the active one can be selected either automatically by the camera or manually by you. Whatever is behind the active focus area is what the camera is going to focus on. There are 3 options for autofocus area mode on the D40: closest subject, dynamic area, and single area. All 3 of them are available in any of the 12 exposure modes. Closest subject, as the name implies, causes the camera to focus on whatever it senses is the closest thing to the lens. That might be okay for snapshots, but it doesn't really allow any creativity in framing your picture. And it's a terrible choice if you're shooting in a crowded area with lots of people, trees, bushes, fences, or anything at all between you and the subject. Single area offers the most precise control, and this is the mode that I recommend you use 100% of the time. With this mode, the camera will focus on the part of the picture that is directly behind whichever one of the 3 focus areas that you highlight with the arrow buttons on the multi-selector. I like it because it gives me exact control over which part of the frame I want to be in focus. You can think of it as crosshairs in a gun sight. The third option, dynamic area, works sort of like single area, but isn't as precise. You get to choose the primary focus area, but if the subject moves, the camera will refocus as it tries to follow the subject. I don't recommend using dynamic area because if the subject moves, you're probably going to pan the camera right along with the subject anyway to keep them centered. So it defeats the purpose and quite often leads to an out-of-focus picture. In the single area and dynamic area modes, you can choose the active focus area by using the left and right arrow buttons on the multi-selector to highlight any of the 3 focus brackets. Once you get in the habit of shooting in this mode, you'll find it's very easy to change the focus area as often as necessary without even giving it any thought at all. The active focus bracket is shown in the viewfinder and on the monitor. As you see, accurate and creative focusing involves more skill than just pointing the camera and letting it do all the work. If you try to get away with that kind of approach, you're going to be very disappointed in the results. I encourage you to get out and practice, experiment with the different settings, and try tracking moving targets like cars, kids, and pets. The more you practice, the better you'll get. Most light sources are not 100% pure white, but have a certain color temperature expressed in degrees Kelvin. For instance, indoor light has a yellow cast to it, and outdoor light looks more blue in comparison. The human eye adapts very quickly to these color temperature variations, so the differences are nearly imperceptible. But your camera isn't that smart. You can help avoid results like this or this by selecting the correct white balance setting on your camera and thus giving your images more accurate color reproduction. The D40 has 8 different white balance options to choose from. You can select the white balance setting you want to use from the shooting information display or from the shooting menu. Let's use the menu this time. Auto is the simplest setting to use, but it offers the least amount of control. Contrary to what Nikon tells you in the D40 owner's manual, out of all the white balance choices, this is the one you should use least often because it provides the most inconsistent results. Incandescent can sometimes be a good choice if you're shooting indoors under typical household lighting. Fluorescent is designed to be used when your primary light source is ordinary fluorescent lighting that has a slightly greenish cast to it. Direct sunlight is for shooting outdoors on sunny days. Flash is usually the best choice whenever you're shooting with either the built-in flash or an external flash. Cloudy can be used for shooting on overcast or mostly cloudy days. Shade is designed for use outdoors when the main subject is in the shade. White balance preset is the final choice, and it's the one I recommend that you use whenever accurate color reproduction is important, because it offers the only way to set the camera's white balance accurately. Why? Because white balance preset is the only one that actually measures the color temperature of the current lighting situation and adjusts the camera to match it. If you use auto, the camera is just making an educated guess. If you use incandescent, fluorescent, direct sunlight, cloudy, or shade, you're just putting the white balance value in the right ballpark. You aren't actually setting the camera for the exact lighting conditions as they truly are at that time and location. For example, does a bright sunny day have the same look at noon as it does at 6 in the evening? No. That's why the one-size-fits-all automated settings aren't very accurate. Are they close enough anyway? Well, sometimes they're good enough for snapshots, but I usually take a few seconds to set my white balance manually with white balance preset before I start shooting. In fact, it's common for a professional photographer to set a custom white balance several times a day, whenever the light changes. And here's how to do it. First, get a neutral white object and place it under the same lighting that will be used for the subject of your photograph. Even a piece of bright white photocopy paper will work. Set the exposure mode to aperture priority. Press the menu button and select the white balance menu. Highlight white balance preset and select it. Now we've got two choices: measure and use photo. If you choose use photo, it will defeat the whole reason for setting a custom white balance. So you'll always want to choose measure so that the white balance is set to match the current lighting conditions. Press OK again to confirm that you want to overwrite the old white balance setting. When you see this screen, fill the viewfinder with the white card and then snap the shutter. No photo will be taken, but the camera will measure the color temperature of the light striking the card and adjust the white balance to match it perfectly. And now you're ready to start shooting with a white balance that's perfectly matched to the current lighting conditions. See how easy it is? And it's a lot faster than trying to fix your pictures later with the computer. One more thing I want to show you before we finish this chapter is how to fine-tune the white balance when you're using the auto, incandescent, fluorescent, direct sunlight, flash, cloudy, or shade settings. Sometimes you might want to make the white balance warmer or cooler for a different creative effect, and it's easy to do. Start by highlighting the white balance setting that comes closest to the type of light where you'll be shooting. Press OK, and then use the arrow buttons to change the value up or down. Positive numbers will make your images a little bluer, and negative numbers will make them redder. Press OK again to lock it in. And you're ready to start shooting with the customized setting. However, be forewarned that there's nothing on the shooting information display to remind you that the white balance setting has been modified. Looking at this screen, it appears that the white balance is just set for cloudy, but it's really set for cloudy -3, which will have a very different look. So be careful about fine-tuning the white balance and then forgetting to put it back again. The D40 simplifies flash photography by coming equipped with a built-in pop-up flash. In some of the point-and-shoot modes, the flash will pop up automatically whenever the camera determines that it's needed. In other point-and-shoot modes, the camera will never pop up the flash, and you can't pop it up manually either. The flash is completely disabled in these modes. However, when you're using any of the advanced shooting modes, you can manually pop up the flash whenever you decide that you want to use it. The decision is completely up to you, and the camera will never pop the flash up on its own in these modes. To open the flash and turn it on, you just press the flash button to release it. And take the picture. Now when you're done, press the flash down until it clicks into place. I wish that I could say that flash photography was just as easy as popping up the flash and shooting away, but it's not. You also need to choose a flash mode. The flash mode is what determines how and when the flash is fired when you take a picture. Turn on the shooting information display, press the I button, scroll to the flash sync mode icon, and press OK. The choices you'll see will be determined by which exposure mode you're using. Right now, this camera is set for aperture priority mode. This icon means fill flash, and it's considered the normal flash mode for most photography. The next choice simply adds red eye reduction to the fill flash mode. The next two modes are called slow sync, with or without red eye reduction, and they attempt to achieve a mix of ambient light and the much brighter light generated from the flash. On the left is an image taken with normal fill flash. The subject looks fine, but you have no sense of the surroundings because the flash has overpowered the ambient light. On the right, we see what happens with slow sync. The camera was able to capture the subject along with the surroundings for a more natural look. The final mode is called rear curtain sync. You might also see the word slow displayed with it, depending on the shooting mode you've selected. Rear curtain fires the flash just before the shutter closes instead of when it first opens. When combined with a slow shutter speed, you'll create a streak behind a moving subject, with the subject frozen at the end of the frame, providing a great sense of motion. If you'd like to learn about using external flash units with your D40, I recommend getting a copy of Magic Lantern Guide's Nikon AF Speedlight Flash System book. It offers comprehensive information on using Nikon's creative lighting system. During this program, we've taken an in-depth look at the most important features of the D40, and I know it can be a lot to absorb in one viewing. I suggest that you watch this DVD again in a few weeks, and I'll bet you'll pick up a few things you missed the first time through. At the end of a workshop like this, people often want to know what the bottom line is. Which specific settings do I recommend? Well, that's almost impossible to answer because I'm constantly changing the settings while I shoot. However, here's what I would say are my typical settings for routine outdoor shooting with the D40. Aperture priority is my preferred shooting mode because I'm comfortable choosing my own camera settings. Personally, I never use any of the point-and-shoot modes, but they can be okay to try if you're new to SLR photography. My quality settings are always set for JPEG Fine and the large file size. I usually set a custom white balance for the most accurate color reproduction. My ISO is usually set at 200 unless conditions are too dark to allow it, and then I raise it just enough to get by. My drive mode is always set to single frame advance, even if I'm shooting sports or action. My autofocus mode is always set on continuous. Single area is my preferred autofocus area mode, so I can manually choose the active focus area that works best for my composition. I use 3D color matrix metering most of the time. I only use exposure compensation or flash compensation when the situation calls for it. Otherwise, I leave them on 0. And finally, I usually keep the optimize image setting on normal. Like I said, there's no perfect group of settings for all situations, and you might find that you disagree with some or all of my recommendations. But part of what makes the D40 so great is that you can customize your camera to work the way you like to shoot. If you want even more detailed information about your camera, I recommend getting a copy of the Magic Lantern Guide's Nikon D40 book. It makes a great companion to this DVD, and it goes far beyond the owner's manual. The D40 is basically a simple camera to operate, but as you've just seen, it also has some highly technical capabilities. The key is not to get so sidetracked with all the wizardry it offers that you forget about having fun while you're taking your pictures. So now it's time to turn off the TV and get out and start taking great photos. And thank you for watching.